The morning sun peeked through worn curtains as Harold Jenkins slowly rose from his bed. At 75, his body reminded him of its age with each movement, a dull ache in his knees and a stiffness in his fingers that never quite went away. Still, he moved with purpose, a lifetime habit that refused to fade with time. His one-bedroom apartment wasn't much, but it was clean and organized. Pictures sat in simple frames on a small bookshelf, younger versions of Harold in uniform, standing alongside men whose faces had begun to blur in his memory, though their names remained clear as day. He never displayed these photos prominently, keeping them turned slightly away from visitors. Not that he had many. Harold's morning routine never changed. He filled the old coffee pot, the same one he'd owned for 20 years, and waited for it to gurgle to life. While the coffee brewed, he stood by his window, looking out at the neighborhood he'd called home for over 4 decades. It had changed, as neighborhoods do. Some changes were good. The new community garden where an abandoned lot once stood, fresh paint on the elementary school. Other changes troubled him. The groups of young men with nothing to do, the empty storefronts, the way elderly neighbors now hurried home before sunset. The coffee pot beeped, and Harold poured himself a cup, black, no sugar. He never developed a taste for sweetness in his coffee during his time in Vietnam, and he saw no reason to start now. His breakfast was simple, toast, sometimes with an egg if his grocery budget had stretched that week. Social Security covered his basics, but there wasn't much left for extras. As he ate, Harold unfolded the day's newspaper. He still preferred paper to those digital screens everyone stared at all day. The news was rarely good, but he believed in staying informed. Wars in places he could find on a map without thinking, political fights that seemed to solve nothing, rising prices that made his careful budget even tighter. He read it all with the same expression, a slight frown, deep lines around his eyes, occasionally a small nod as if confirming something he already knew. By 8:30, Harold had washed his dishes, made his bed with military precision, and changed into clean clothes, pressed khaki pants, a buttoned shirt in warm weather or a flannel in cold, and sturdy walking shoes that had seen better days but were well maintained. The final touch was always his faded blue veteran's cap, worn not for attention, but as a quiet acknowledgement of a part of his life that still defined him, even all these years later. The walk to Jefferson Park took exactly 12 minutes if he maintained his pace. Harold could have told you precisely how many steps it would take. A habit formed during patrols where knowing distances could save lives. Along the way, he passed Mrs. Chen watering her impressive collection of potted plants on her tiny porch. They exchanged nods as they did each morning, their friendship existing in these small, wordless greetings. "Beautiful day, Mr. Jenkins," she called out, breaking their usual silent routine. "That it is, Mrs. Chen," he replied with a small smile that softened his weathered face. "Those flowers are looking mighty fine." She beamed at the compliment, and Harold continued on his way, his posture straightening just a bit. These small interactions were often the only conversations he had all day. The neighborhood had changed around him. When Harold first moved here after returning from Vietnam, it had been a solid working-class area, mostly families who had been there for generations. Now it was a mix, some old-timers like him, immigrant families bringing new life and different languages, young couples who couldn't afford the trendy areas downtown, and too many empty houses where foreclosure signs told silent stories of hard times. Jefferson Park itself had seen better days. The playground equipment needed paint, one swing always hung empty where a chain had broken, and the basketball court had cracks where determined weeds pushed through. But it had tall old trees that provided shade for Harold's favorite bench, the one with a view of both the playground and the small pond where ducks gathered. As Harold approached his bench, he noticed it was occupied, an unusual occurrence at this hour. A young man sat hunched over, hands busy with his phone. Harold hesitated, his routine disrupted. For a moment he considered finding another spot, but something in him resisted the change. "Morning," Harold said, his voice deeper than his frame might suggest. "Mind if I sit?" The young man looked up surprised, then quickly moved over. "No problem, sir." Harold nodded his thanks and settled on his end of the bench, noticing how the young man stole curious glances at his veteran's cap. "Vietnam?" the young man finally asked, gesturing toward the hat. "That's right," Harold replied, not elaborating. Those 2 words contained volumes he rarely shared. The young man nodded, returning to his phone, but after a few minutes he spoke again. My grandfather was there too. Never talked about it much. Harold's eyes remained on the pond where ducks glided across the water's surface. Not much to say that folks would understand. The truth was more complicated. Harold had served 2 tours with Special Forces, operations that remained classified even now. He'd done things that haunted his dreams, seen things that sometimes made him wake up gasping for air. Sheets soaked with sweat even in winter. He'd saved lives and taken them. He'd learned skills that had no place in civilian life. How to move silently through impossible terrain, how to use his body as a weapon, how to size up threats in seconds. None of this showed on his face as he sat peacefully watching the park come to life. To anyone passing by, he was just another old man enjoying the morning sun, perhaps a bit more straight-backed than most. His eyes perhaps a bit more watchful. The young man eventually left with a respectful nod, and Harold had his bench to himself again. From his pocket he took a small bag of bread crusts he'd saved from yesterday's lunch. Feeding the ducks was technically against park rules. Now the signs warned it was bad for their digestion, but it was a small rebellion. Harold allowed himself. As he tossed small pieces toward the gathering birds, Harold's mind drifted back to another time when he'd sat by water, a muddy river in a country thousands of miles away. His unit had stopped for a rare moment of rest. Someone had played a harmonica, soft enough not to give away their position. For just a moment they had felt almost like normal young men, not soldiers in a war none of them fully understood. A child's laughter pulled him back to the present. A little girl chasing bubbles her mother blew into the air. Harold watched, a small smile crossing his face. These moments of simple joy were what he'd fought for, though he'd realized that too late. By 11, the sun was high, and Harold's knees told him it was time to move. He followed his usual path home, stopping at Johnson's grocery where the owner's son, Thomas, greeted him by name. "Morning, Mr. Jenkins. Dad put aside a loaf of that sourdough you like. Said to tell you it's on special today." Harold knew there was probably no special, just Thomas's father being kind to a regular customer on a fixed income. He accepted with dignity. "Tell your father I appreciate that." The store had changed too, carrying more international foods now to serve the neighborhood's newer residents. Harold sometimes bought things he couldn't identify just to try them. Last week it had been a spicy paste that had lit his mouth on fire, but brought back memories of far-off places. As he paid for his bread and a few other essentials, Harold noticed a group of young men loitering near the store entrance. They weren't doing anything wrong exactly, but something about their posture, their watchful eyes, triggered the alert system he'd developed decades ago and never fully shut off. Thomas noticed his gaze. "They've been hanging around more lately," he said quietly as he handed Harold his change. "Dad's had to call the police twice last month when they hassled Mrs. Porter." Harold nodded, absorbing this information without comment. Mrs. Porter was at least 80, a widow who walked with 2 canes and still baked cookies for the church bake sale. Outside, Harold walked past the group, his eyes forward, posture straight. He felt their eyes on him but didn't acknowledge them. One made a comment he pretended not to hear and another laughed. Harold kept walking, his pace unhurried but purposeful. Back in his apartment, he put away his groceries with the same precision he applied to everything. Each item had its place. Order was important to Harold, had been since his first day of basic training when chaos became intolerable. The afternoon stretched before him. Sometimes he read books from the library. Histories mostly, occasionally spy novels that made him chuckle at their inaccuracies. Sometimes he worked on small wood carvings, little animals he created with a pocket knife and surprising delicacy for his large hands. He never kept them, instead leaving them on park benches for children to find. Today he felt restless. The encounter outside the store had stirred something in him, an awareness he hadn't felt in some time. Harold went to his closet and pulled out an old shoebox from the top shelf. Inside was a medal he never displayed, photos he rarely looked at, and a worn journal filled with names. He touched each item gently, then closed the box and returned it to its place. Whatever storms gathered outside, Harold Jenkins would face them as he had faced everything in his 75 years, with quiet strength, with the skills life had given him, and with the hope that peace might still be possible, even in a changing world that sometimes forgot men like him. The changing seasons had always marked time for Harold. This Tuesday in late September brought the first real hint of fall, a crispness to the morning air that reminded him of countless dawns spent waiting silently in forests half a world away. He pulled his worn jacket closer as he stepped out for his daily walk to Jefferson Park, noticing how the maple trees along Preston Street had begun their slow turn to gold. For 3 days now, Harold had been watching the group of young men who'd taken to gathering near the northeast corner of the park. At first, he'd dismissed them as just neighborhood kids with nowhere better to be. But his instincts, honed by years when noticing small details meant survival, told him something wasn't right. They were too watchful, too deliberate in how they positioned themselves along the paths most often used by older residents. Yesterday, he'd seen Mrs. Chen taking the long way around to avoid them. When he'd asked her about it while she watered her plants this morning, she'd looked away, uncomfortable. They asked for money, she'd finally admitted, said they were protecting the neighborhood. Her hands had trembled slightly as she poured water onto her chrysanthemums. "I'm old, Mr. Jenkins, I don't want trouble." Harold had nodded, his face giving away nothing of the slow anger building inside him. Mrs. Chen had lived in this neighborhood longer than he had. She baked cookies for the children at the elementary school every Christmas, regardless of whether they celebrated the holiday. The thought of her being afraid to walk home made something cold and familiar stir in his chest. Today, Harold deliberately took his usual route, even though he'd been avoiding it recently. His eyes scanned the area with a casualness that belied their sharpness. 4 young men lounged near the park entrance, the same ones he'd seen outside Johnson's grocery. They ranged in age from perhaps 17 to early 20s. The oldest, tall with a red hoodie, seemed to be the leader. He had a way of standing, weight on his back foot ready to move, that Harold recognized from men who expected trouble and welcomed it. Harold didn't change his pace as he approached. He walked as he always did, straight-backed, unhurried, his veteran's cap pulled low. As he passed within 15 feet of the group, he heard their conversation drop, felt their eyes tracking him. He gave no indication he noticed. "Hey, old-timer," called the one in the red hoodie. "Got any spare change for the neighborhood watch?" Harold kept walking, his face impassive. "I'm talking to you, Grandpa." The voice came again, harder now. Harold stopped, turned slowly. He looked at each young face in turn, his expression neutral. "No change to spare today, gentlemen. Enjoy the morning." His voice was calm, measured, the same tone he'd used with nervous new recruits and hostile villagers alike. The leader stepped forward, his friends flanking him. "That's not how this works. We're keeping the neighborhood safe, you understand? That service ain't free." Harold noted how the others positioned themselves, not trained but instinctive animals establishing dominance. The smallest one, barely more than a boy with a patchy attempt at a beard, looked uncomfortable, eyes darting between Harold and his friends. "I appreciate the concern for safety," Harold said, "but I've been walking this path for 30 years without needing protection." A second youth snorted, heavy-set with a scar above his right eyebrow. "Times change, old man. Neighborhood ain't what it used to be." Harold allowed himself a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. "On that we agree." He turned to continue his walk, dismissing them. It was a calculated risk. In his experience, men like these, boys really, relied on fear. When it wasn't given, they often backed down. Sometimes they didn't. "Don't you walk away when I'm talking to you." The leader's voice had risen, drawing attention from a mother hurrying her child along a distant path. Harold paused again, shoulders relaxing in a way that would have alarmed anyone who knew what it meant. His body preparing, weight centering, old instincts waking, but he simply stood, waiting. The leader approached, stopping just inside what Harold still thought of as striking distance. Close enough to be threatening, far enough to feel safe. Harold noted the slight bulge at his waistband. Possibly a weapon, possibly just a cell phone. "You disrespecting us, old man?" The question came with a step closer. "No disrespect intended," Harold replied. "Just an old man going for his walk." "That hat?" The leader nodded at Harold's veteran's cap. "You really serve or you just wear that for show?" Something flickered in Harold's eyes, the only reaction he allowed himself. "I served. 2 tours in Vietnam. Special Forces." The heavy-set youth laughed. "My grandpa says they lost that war." Harold didn't respond to the bait. Instead, he studied the leader more carefully. Beneath the practiced swagger, he saw what he always had in young men playing at being dangerous. Uncertainty, a need to prove something, and the dangerous combination of fear and pride that made them unpredictable. "Your grandfather's welcome to his opinion," Harold finally said. "Now, if you'll excuse me." He turned again and this time made it 3 steps before he heard rapid movement behind him. Old reflexes nearly took over. A sidestep, a sweep, a strike. Movements his body remembered even if his joints protested. Instead, he simply turned, quicker than a man his age should move, and found himself facing the leader who'd rushed to cut him off. "Maybe you don't understand how things work now," the young man said, voice lower, meant to intimidate. "This is our corner. Nobody walks through without paying the toll." Harold looked past him to the other 3 who had spread out slightly. The youngest still looked uncertain, hanging back. The heavy-set one had his hand in his pocket. The third, thin with nervous eyes, kept looking around to see if anyone was watching. "Son," Harold said quietly, "I'm going to say this once. I'm going home now. You and your friends should find something better to do with your day." The leader's face darkened. "You calling me son now? You think that badge on your hat means something? That was 50 years ago, old man. This is our time now." Harold sighed, a genuine sound of weariness, not fear. He'd moved beyond fear decades ago, but a deep tiredness at seeing the same patterns repeat themselves across generations. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly. The question seemed to throw the young man off balance. "What?" "Your name," Harold repeated patiently, after a hesitation. "People call me Dex." "Dex." Harold nodded. "I'm Harold Jenkins." Now we've been properly introduced instead of just being a threat and a target to each other. The unexpected civility created a moment of confusion that Harold recognized as an opening, not for violence, those days were behind him, but for something else he'd learned in war. Sometimes the best way through a situation wasn't fighting or fleeing, but simply changing its nature. "I'd guess you're about 20, Dex." Harold continued conversationally. The young man frowned, uncertain where this was going. 22, Harold nodded. "When I was 22, I was in a jungle halfway around the world, carrying men my age who'd never walk again. Some days I think I'm still carrying them." He tapped his temple lightly. "Up here." For a moment, something shifted in the younger man's expression, recognition perhaps of a pain he understood in some way. But it hardened again quickly. "That's a sad story and all, but it doesn't change anything. You still gotta pay to walk through here." Harold looked at him steadily. "I don't carry cash, Dex, just my ID and my house key." "Then maybe you need to go to the ATM with us," suggested the heavy-set youth. Stepping closer, Harold noted how they were positioning themselves now, the leader in front, the others moving to flank him. Simple tactics, but effective against most people, not against someone who'd spent decades analyzing threats before they even materialized. "That won't be happening," Harold said, his voice unchanged but somehow carrying a new weight that made the youngest of the group take a small step back. The leader noticed, and his face flushed with anger, at Harold, at his friend's show of weakness, at the situation slipping from his control. "You don't get to decide that," he snapped, and reached for Harold's arm. Harold didn't move away. He didn't need to. Something in his stillness, in the way he stood, made the young man's hand hesitate before making contact. In that moment of hesitation, a police cruiser turned the corner, rolling slowly along the street that bordered the park. Its presence was coincidental. Regular patrol, nothing more, but its timing changed everything. The group noticed immediately, their attention shifting, bodies angling away from Harold. "This isn't over." "Old man," the leader muttered, backing away. Harold watched them retreat toward the basketball courts, their postures changing, hostility temporarily masked. He stood where he was, giving a small nod to the officer in the cruiser, who returned the gesture without stopping. Only when the patrol car had passed did Harold continue his walk, choosing his usual bench overlooking the pond. His heart rate hadn't changed throughout the encounter. His hands were steady as he reached into his pocket for the bread crust he'd brought for the ducks. As he sat there, outwardly calm, Harold's mind worked through what had just happened and what would come next. The confrontation wasn't over, merely postponed. The young men would be back, perhaps more determined after being denied. They would see his age and mistake it for weakness. not understanding that some things improved with time, patience, observation, the ability to see 10 steps ahead in any situation. What troubled Harold wasn't fear for himself. It was thinking of Mrs. Chen, of Mr. Johnson at the grocery store, of the elderly couple who walked hand in hand through the park every evening, people who hadn't spent their lives learning how to handle threats, people who deserved better than to be afraid in their own neighborhood. By the time the ducks had consumed the last of his bread crusts, Harold had made a decision. His path home would take him right back past the basketball courts. And this time he wouldn't be walking around them. The afternoon sun hung lower in the sky as Harold made his way back toward the basketball courts. His path was deliberate, not seeking confrontation but not avoiding it either. In his long life, Harold had learned that problems rarely solve themselves. Sometimes you had to walk straight through the storm to find clear skies on the other side. The courts were busy now. A pickup game occupied half the space, teenagers calling out to each other, their movements quick and careless with youth. On the far side, Harold spotted Dex and his friends. They'd grown to 6 now, the additional 2 unknown to him. They lounged against the chain-link fence watching the game but more attentive to who passed by. Harold noticed an older woman crossing the street to avoid them. Her shopping bag clutched tight against her side. As Harold approached, walking steadily with the same measured pace he always maintained, he felt eyes turn his way. The game faltered, players sensing the tension before they fully understood its source. Harold kept his eyes forward, his path taking him directly past the group. Dex straightened when he saw Harold nudging the others. Their conversation stopped, replaced by watchful silence. Harold nodded to them as he would to any neighbor, nothing in his manner suggesting their earlier confrontation. "Look who's back," Dex called out loud enough for everyone to hear. The war hero. Harold stopped, turning to face them fully. "Afternoon, gentlemen." His voice carried just enough to be heard, no more. He had never been one to shout, having learned long ago that quiet words often carried more weight. The heavy-set youth, Harold had heard one of the others call him Trent, stepped forward. "You got a hearing problem, old man? Didn't we tell you about the toll?" Several of the basketball players drifted closer, curious or concerned. Harold noticed one pull out a phone, though whether to record or call for help he couldn't tell. "I heard you," Harold replied. "I just don't agree with your policy." This earned a laugh from Dex. "It's not up for debate." Harold studied them, taking in details most would miss. The nervous energy in their movements. How 2 kept looking toward the street, watching for police. The way Dex kept his right hand near his waistband. The newest additions to the group trying to look harder than they felt, still proving themselves. "Everything's up for debate in a neighborhood where people look out for each other," Harold said, his tone conversational. "Mrs. Chen's lived here 40 years. Mr. Wilson at the corner house has cancer treatments on Thursdays. The Rivera family sends their kids to school with homemade lunches even when money's tight." He took a single step closer. "These are my neighbors. I'm not paying you to harass them." Something flickered across Dex's face, surprise that this old man knew everyone's business, perhaps, or discomfort at having their actions named so plainly. "You think you're some kind of neighborhood watchdog?" Dex recovered quickly, his voice mocking. "This ain't the 60s, Pops. You don't matter anymore." The words were meant to sting, but Harold had been dismissed by better men than this. He simply waited, saying nothing, his silence a challenge more effective than any retort. Dex moved forward, his friends following his lead. The basketball game had completely stopped now, players lingering at the edges, uncertain witnesses to what was unfolding. "Empty your pockets," Dex demanded, close enough now that Harold could smell the cigarette smoke on his clothes. "No," Harold said simply. The word hung in the air between them, just one syllable but spoken with such quiet certainty that it landed like a stone. "You don't get to say no to me." Dex's voice rose, color spreading across his face. Harold recognized the look, a young man afraid of losing face, a dangerous moment when pride overrode reason. "Everyone gets to say no, son," Harold replied. "That's one of the things I fought for." Dex's hand moved to his waistband, pulling back his hoodie enough to reveal what Harold had suspected, the black handle of a pistol tucked against his hip. Not drawing it, just making sure Harold saw it. "You still want to say no?" Dex asked, voice lower now. The sight of the weapon didn't change Harold's expression. In truth, he'd faced far worse with far less training than he had now. Instead of fear, He felt a familiar calm settling over him, the clarity that had kept him alive in situations where others had fallen. "I'm going to give you some advice," Harold said, his eyes not on the gun but on Dex's face. "And you'd be wise to take it because it comes from experience you don't have." He spoke clearly, each word measured and deliberate. "First, if you're carrying that for protection, you're doing it wrong. A weapon you show but don't use is worse than having none at all. Second, there are at least 3 witnesses with phones recording this interaction right now." He didn't look around to confirm this, but he'd noticed the devices coming out, held low but pointed their way. "And third," Harold continued, his voice unchanged but somehow filling the space between them, "if you draw that gun, you'd better be prepared to use it. And if you use it, you'd better not miss, because what comes after will happen very quickly, and I guarantee you won't like the outcome." For a long moment, no one moved. Harold stood relaxed but balanced, his body aligned in a way that would mean nothing to most observers but would be immediately recognizable to anyone with combat training. His hands hung open at his sides, deceptively passive. Dex's friends exchanged glances, suddenly uncertain. The youngest one, hardly more than 16, took a half-step back. "You threatening me, old man?" Dex finally asked, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "Not at all," Harold replied. "Just explaining consequences. Something my drill sergeant was very good at." The standoff might have continued, but a new voice cut through the tension. "Everything all right over here?" Officer Ray Powell, a patrolman Harold recognized from community meetings, had stopped his cruiser along the park's edge. He hadn't emerged from the vehicle yet, just rolled down his window, but his presence was enough to shift the equation. "Fine, officer," Dex called back, his hand moving away from his waistband. "Just talking with our neighbor here." Officer Powell's eyes moved to Harold. "Mr. Jenkins? You good?" Harold nodded. "Afternoon, Officer Powell. Just having a discussion about community relations." The officer studied the scene for a moment longer. "Well, I'll be around the block if the discussion needs any moderating." The message was clear enough. As the patrol car pulled away, Dex's posture changed, the immediate threat receding, but his anger clearly not. "This isn't over," he muttered. "It could be," Harold countered. "There are better ways to be somebody in this neighborhood than taking from people who worked all their lives for what little they have." For the briefest moment, something vulnerable flickered across Dex's face, a glimpse of the boy beneath the hardened exterior. Then it was gone, replaced by practiced indifference. "Whatever, old man. Keep walking." Harold did exactly that, continuing his path home with the same measured stride. He didn't look back, but he felt their eyes on him until he turned the corner. Only then did he allow himself a deep breath, flexing his hands to release the tension he hadn't shown. As he approached his apartment building, Harold saw Mrs. Chen on her small porch, watching for his return. The concern in her eyes told him she'd heard about the earlier confrontation. "You shouldn't challenge them," she said as he neared. "They're young, they're foolish." "We were all young once," Harold replied. "Some of us were foolish too," she studied his face. "You were never foolish, Mr. Jenkins, I can tell." The observation made him smile faintly. "You'd be surprised." Inside his apartment, Harold went through his evening routine without variation. He prepared a simple dinner, washed his few dishes, and settled in his chair with a book. But his mind kept returning to the confrontation, analyzing it from all angles as he'd been trained to do. The gun changed things, not for himself. Harold had faced weapons before and would again if necessary, but for the neighborhood. A young man with a gun and something to prove was a danger to everyone. As darkness fell, Harold rose and went to his closet. The shoebox came down again, but this time he reached beyond it to the far corner of the shelf. His fingers found a small key taped to the wall, hidden from casual discovery. Harold stood for a long moment, key in hand, considering choices and consequences with the gravity of a man who had seen where violence led. Then, decision made, he returned the key to its hiding place and closed the closet. Tonight, at least, there were still other options to explore. Tomorrow would be soon enough to decide if more drastic measures were needed. After all, he hadn't survived 2 tours in Vietnam and 50 years of civilian life by acting rashly. As he prepared for bed, Harold heard raised voices from the street below, Dex and his friends passing by, their laughter sharp-edged in the night air. He stood at his window, watching as they moved through pools of streetlight, their young faces alternately illuminated and hidden by darkness. In those moments of visibility, Harold saw what others missed, not just threats, but lost boys playing at being men, searching for purpose, for respect, for the very things he'd once sought himself. The recognition didn't make them less dangerous. If anything, it made them more so. Harold turned away from the window, switching off his lamp. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, and he would be ready. Morning arrived with a heavy fog that clung to the streets, turning familiar shapes into ghostly outlines. Harold stood at his window, coffee cup warming his hands, watching as early risers moved through the mist like figures from another world. The weather reminded him of dawn patrols in the highlands. The way sound traveled differently, how a person could be 5 feet away and invisible, how every sense heightened to compensate. He'd slept poorly, his dreams filled with faces from the past mixed with those from yesterday. Young men in different times, different places, but with the same lost eyes. Harold's morning routine remained unchanged, despite his restless night. The newspaper, the dishes, the carefully buttoned shirt, habits were anchors in a changing world. As he placed his veteran's cap on his head, his phone rang, a rare enough occurrence that he paused, wondering who would call at this hour. Mr. Jenkins? The voice belonged to Thomas from the grocery store. Just wanted to give you a heads up. Those guys who've been hanging around, they were asking about you this morning, where you live, when you usually come by the store. Harold felt something cold settle in his stomach. Not fear, he was long past that, but the familiar weight of approaching conflict. Thanks for letting me know, Thomas. My dad says maybe you should stay home today, Thomas continued, concern evident in his voice. Or at least change your routine. They seemed pretty worked up. I appreciate the warning, Harold said. You and your father are good people. After hanging up, Harold stood motionless in the center of his small living room. Staying home wasn't in his nature. Hiding solved nothing. But walking into an ambush was foolish, regardless of his training. He made his decision and reached for his jacket, the heavier one despite the mild temperature. As he slipped it on, he felt the reassuring weight in the inside pocket. Not a weapon, but something that might prove equally useful. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift, though it still hung between buildings like cotton caught on corners. Harold took a different route than usual, moving with purpose but remaining watchful. The streets were quieter than normal, the weather keeping many indoors. He was halfway to the park when he sensed rather than saw movement behind him. Footsteps trying too hard to be quiet, the rustle of clothing from someone unused to moving silently. Harold continued walking, giving no indication he'd noticed. But his mind was already mapping the area around him. The narrow alley to his right, the low wall to his left, the distance to the corner ahead. Hey, war hero. Dex's voice came from behind, closer than Harold expected. He turned slowly to find the young man standing 10 feet away. Not alone. Trent and 2 others flanked him, spreading out to block potential escape routes. The youngest one from yesterday was notably absent. Morning, Dex, Harold replied calmly, his eyes taking in everything, the way Trent's hand was buried in his jacket pocket, how the unknown youth to Dex's left kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, nervous energy. Unpredictable. You've been asking about me, Harold continued before Dex could speak again. Could have just come to my door if you wanted to talk. This seemed to catch Dex off guard. How'd you know that? Harold offered a small smile. Small neighborhoods have long memories and quick tongues. The fog swirled between them, dampening sounds from the rest of the world. It created an odd intimacy, as if they stood in a space separate from the normal flow of life. We're not here to talk, Dex said, recovering his composure. You disrespected me yesterday, made me look weak in front of my people. Respect is earned, Harold replied. Not taken, Dex's face hardened. I tried to keep this simple. A little tax for walking through our territory. Now it's about something else. He stepped forward. Empty your pockets. All of them. And that watch too. Harold glanced at his wrist. The old Timex had been a gift from his unit after his second tour. Its value was negligible to anyone but him. I don't think I will, Harold said quietly. Dex nodded to the others, who began moving forward. Then we'll do it the hard way. Harold didn't back away. Instead, he shifted his stance slightly. Nothing dramatic, just a small adjustment in how his weight was distributed, how his feet were positioned. To a casual observer, nothing had changed. To someone with combat training, Harold had just moved from passive to ready. Last chance to walk away, Harold offered, his voice still conversational. Find something better to do with your day. Trent laughed, pulling his hand from his pocket to reveal a switchblade. The blade snapped open with a click that seemed loud in the fog-muffled street. Old man still thinks he's tough. Not tough, Harold corrected. Just experienced. They came at him together as he knew they would. Untrained but with the confidence of youth and numbers. Trent lunged first, blade extended while the others moved to grab Harold's arms. What happened next occurred so quickly that later, none of them could quite piece it together. Harold sidestepped Trent's thrust with a fluid economy of movement that seemed impossible for a man his age. His hand caught Trent's wrist, applying pressure to a nerve point that sent shockwaves of pain up the younger man's arm. The knife clattered to the ground. The second youth found himself stumbling forward as Harold simply wasn't where he should have been. A subtle shift of Harold's foot, a gentle redirection of momentum, and the young man's own forward motion sent him sprawling to the pavement. The third grabbed for Harold's jacket, fingers closing on fabric only to have Harold turn into the grip rather than away, stepping close instead of pulling back. Harold's elbow connected with the youth's solar plexus, not a strike but a positioning, applying pressure rather than force. The young man doubled over, struggling to breathe. Dex had backed up a step, hand moving to his waistband. Harold saw the motion and responded with the speed of a man for whom such moments had once been daily occurrences. Before Dex could draw the gun, Harold was beside him. One hand clamped around Dex's wrist, the other moved to his shoulder, applying pressure to specific points that made Dex's fingers go numb, unable to grip. The gun, a cheap semi-automatic that Harold recognized as the kind sold in back alleys, fell from nerveless fingers. Harold kicked it away, the weapon spinning across wet pavement into a storm drain with a distant splash. The entire encounter had taken less than 10 seconds. None of Harold's movements had been hurried or frantic. There were no wild punches, no dramatic kicks. Just precise, controlled motions learned through years of training and refined through brutal experience. Harold now stood in the center of the group, unharmed and barely breathing hard. Trent was on one knee, cradling his wrist. The others were in various states of shock and discomfort. None seriously injured, but all suddenly aware of how completely they had misjudged the situation. Dex stared at Harold, his expression a mixture of pain, fear, and confusion. "What the hell are you?" "Just a man who's seen enough fighting to last several lifetimes," Harold replied, straightening his jacket. "And who'd rather not see any more." Sirens sounded in the distance, growing louder. Someone had called the police, perhaps a witness from one of the apartments overlooking the street, or maybe the shopkeeper at the corner store whose security camera had captured everything. "You should go," Harold said to the young men. "Police response time in this neighborhood is about 4 minutes. You've got less than 2 left." None of them moved, still processing what had happened. "I mean it." Harold's voice took on an edge of command that broke through their shock. "Go home, rethink your choices, find a better path." Trent was the first to scramble to his feet, backing away without taking his eyes off Harold. The others followed, helping each other up, their earlier bravado replaced by wary respect. Only Dex remained, still rubbing his wrist where Harold's grip had left marks. "Who taught you to fight like that?" "Uncle Sam," Harold replied, "and a lot of men who didn't make it home to grow old." The sirens were very close now, perhaps a block away. "I can't go back to jail," Dex said. A flail. Shoved genuine fear crossing his face. 3 strikes law. Harold studied him for a moment, seeing past the hardened exterior to the scared young man beneath. Then he reached into his jacket's inner pocket and pulled out what he'd brought with him. Not a weapon, but a small digital voice recorder. He pressed a button and Dex's voice emerged from the tiny speaker. "We're not here to talk. You disrespected me yesterday." Harold clicked it off. "Insurance," he explained. "I've seen too many situations go sideways not to have backup." Dex stared at the recorder, understanding dawning. "You're going to give that to the cops." "That depends on you," Harold said as the police car turned the corner, emerging from the last wisps of fog. "I'd rather give them a different story." Officer Powell was first out of the car, hand on his holster as he took in the scene. Harold standing calmly, Dex looking shaken, the dropped switchblade still visible on the pavement. "Mr. Jenkins?" the officer called, approaching cautiously. "You all right?" Harold nodded. Fine, officer. Just having another discussion with my young neighbor here. He gestured toward Dex. He was kind enough to help me when I nearly took a fall in this fog. Bad knee acting up again. Officer Powell looked between them, skepticism clear on his face. That right? He asked Dex after a moment's hesitation. Dex nodded. Yes, sir. Just helping out. The officer's eyes found the knife on the ground. And that? Mine, Harold said smoothly. Must have fallen from my pocket when I stumbled. Old habit from my service days, carrying a pocket knife, though I believe that particular style might not be street legal anymore. He gave the officer an apologetic smile. My mistake. Powell studied them both for a long moment, clearly not believing the story but unable to disprove it without a complainant. Why don't I give you a ride home, Mr. Jenkins? He finally offered. Make sure you get there safely. Thank you, officer, but I think I'll walk, Harold replied. Good for the joints to keep moving. And I believe Dex was about to tell me about some community service opportunities at the recreation center. He gave Dex a meaningful look. Weren't you? Understanding passed between them, an offer and an obligation in equal measure. Yeah, Dex said slowly. They need help with the after-school program. Thought maybe, with your military background, Harold nodded. Sounds like something we should discuss further. Perhaps tomorrow? The tension in the air gradually dissipated as Officer Powell, still suspicious but with no cause for action, eventually returned to his patrol car after collecting the knife. As the police cruiser pulled away, Harold and Dex stood facing each other in the now clear morning light. Something changed between them. Why? Dex finally asked. Why help me after what we tried to do? Harold considered the question carefully before answering. Because 50 years ago I was angry too, and someone gave me a chance to be something better than my worst instincts. He held up the recorder. This buys you one chance. Just one. Dex nodded slowly, a complex mix of emotions crossing his face. That move you did with the wrist lock, that was something. That, Harold said with the ghost of a smile, was just the beginning of what I could show you, if you're interested in learning. The recreation center on Pine Street had seen better days. Paint peeled from the walls in long strips, revealing layers of colors marking different decades. The basketball hoops hung at slightly different heights, their nets either missing or frayed beyond recognition. But on this Wednesday afternoon, 2 weeks after the confrontation in the fog, it buzzed with an energy that had been missing for years. Harold stood near the wall, watching as a dozen kids ran drills across the worn court. Most were between 10 and 14, too young to have been drawn into serious trouble but old enough to be at risk. At the center of the action stood Dex, his voice carrying across the room as he demonstrated a proper defensive stance. Low center of gravity, he called out. Quick feet, not heavy steps. There you go, Anthony, just like that. Harold nodded slightly in approval. The boy had a natural way with the younger kids. They responded to him in a way they might not to an adult authority figure. And Dex seemed different here, his usual hard edges softened, a genuine smile occasionally breaking through his carefully maintained facade. When the scrimmage ended and the kids scattered to collect their belongings, Dex approached Harold, towel around his neck. What did you think? He asked, trying to sound casual. But Harold caught the note of uncertainty beneath the question. Good footwork, Harold replied. You've played before. Dex shrugged. Almost got a scholarship. Tore my ACL senior year. His eyes drifted to the kids now filing out of the gym. Never had a plan B. The simple statement explained much about the young man's path. Harold had seen it countless times. Dreams derailed by a single moment. Potential redirected toward whatever offered immediate reward or respect. They listen to you, Harold observed. That's not something you can teach. A shadow of pride crossed Dex's face before he shrugged again, uncomfortable with the praise. They just need someone to show up. Most of their dads don't. Harold let the comment sit between them, recognizing the unintentional glimpse into Dex's own history. The community center director, a stocky woman named Grace who'd run the place for 20 years on increasingly limited funding, appeared at the gym entrance. You two still coming to the neighborhood meeting tonight? She called over. Harold nodded. We'll be there. When she'd gone, Dex shot Harold a look. Still don't see why I need to go to some boring meeting with a bunch of old people. Because those old people are deciding whether to give this program funding, Harold replied. And because showing up matters. It had been Harold's condition. Dex would work with the youth program 3 afternoons a week and attend community meetings as needed. In return, Harold had not only kept his silence about the attempted robbery, but had begun teaching Dex some of the discipline and skills he'd learned decades ago, not the fighting techniques. Those would come only after trust was fully established, but the foundations, breathing exercises, meditation, focus drills that could steady a hand or calm a racing mind, the same tools that had helped Harold navigate the aftermath of war. Trent's been asking about joining, Dex said suddenly. Says he's tired of hanging on corners. Harold considered this. Trent had been the most resistant to change, nursing both his injured pride and wrist after their confrontation. Is he serious or just curious about what you're learning? Both, probably, Dex admitted. But he's not as bad as he acts. His mom's sick, needs expensive medicine. That's why he started. He trailed off, still uncomfortable discussing their former activities directly. Harold nodded. Understanding motivations had always been key to assessing both enemies and allies. Bring him tomorrow. We'll see. Later that evening, the community center's meeting room filled with faces Harold had known for years, but rarely spoken with beyond simple greetings. Mrs. Chen sat near the front, nodding to Harold as he entered with Dex trailing behind him. Officer Powell stood near the coffee urn, eyebrows raising slightly at their arrival together. Thomas and his father from the grocery store waved from across the room. Quite a turnout, Harold observed to Grace as she handed him an agenda. Word got around that you were involved with the new youth program, she replied with a knowing smile. People are curious. You've lived here 30 years and most folks still know you only as the quiet veteran from apartment 3B. The meeting progressed through typical neighborhood concerns. A proposed stoplight at the dangerous intersection by the elementary school, complaints about garbage collection, updates on the community garden project. Dex sat stiffly beside Harold, clearly uncomfortable but making an effort to appear attentive. When Grace finally reached the topic of the youth program, Harold felt Dex tense beside him. As most of you know, we've been trying to restart our after-school activities, Grace explained. The challenge, as always, is finding volunteers and securing even minimal funding for equipment and snacks. She gestured toward Harold and Dex. Thanks to Mr. Jenkins and Mr. Washington here, we've started basketball training 3 days a week. But we need community support to expand and sustain it. Harold hadn't planned to speak. He'd spent decades in the neighborhood as a watcher, not a participant. But something about the moment, the way Dex stared at his hands, the hopeful expression on Grace's face, the memory of children laughing in a gym that had been silent too long, pushed him to his feet. Many of you don't know me well, he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the room. That's on me. I came back from Vietnam looking for quiet, and I found it. Maybe too much of it. The room had gone still, people leaning forward slightly, surprised by this unexpected speech from the neighborhood's most private resident. I've watched kids grow up on these streets for 30 years. Watched some find their way and others get lost. Didn't step in because I figured it wasn't my place. He paused, gathering thoughts he hadn't realized he needed to express until this moment. I was wrong about that. Community isn't just about living side by side. It's about reaching across when someone needs a hand. His eyes found Mrs. Chen, who smiled encouragingly. Some of these young men have made mistakes. Some have scared you, maybe hurt you. I understand that. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. But they're still our neighbors. Still our responsibility. He gestured to Dex, who looked up in surprise. Mr. Washington here has natural leadership abilities. Kids listen to him. Respect him. He's giving his time for free because he sees what I took too long to see. That we're all connected in this place we call home. Harold hadn't spoken this many words at once in years, perhaps decades. Yet they flowed now, unforced and genuine. I'm proposing we create a proper youth mentorship program. Not just basketball, but job skills, tutoring, whatever these kids need. I'm willing to contribute financially to get it started. A surprised murmur ran through the room. Harold had always lived modestly, but few knew of the careful investments he'd made over decades of frugal living. The program needs more than money, though. It needs all of us. Our time, our skills, our willingness to see potential instead of problems. When Harold finished speaking and returned to his seat, the silence held for a long moment before Officer Powell stood. I can volunteer 2 evenings a month to teach basic criminal justice concepts, he offered. Maybe get some of these kids interested in law enforcement as a career. This broke the dam. Soon others were speaking up. Mr. Johnson offering part-time jobs at the grocery store for reliable teens, a retired teacher volunteering to tutor, Mrs. Chen promising to provide snacks twice a week. Beside Harold, Dex sat with an expression of disbelief, watching as a community he'd only seen as targets for harassment transformed into something else entirely. Allies, supporters, neighbors. As the meeting concluded, people approached them, some cautiously, others with enthusiasm. Officer Powell shook Dex's hand firmly, their previous encounters acknowledged but set aside in favor of this new beginning. Walking home under streetlights just starting to flicker on, Harold and Dex moved in comfortable silence for several blocks. "Why'd you do all this?" Dex finally asked. "You could have just called the cops that day. Had us locked up. Problem solved." Harold considered the question, looking up at the darkening sky where the first stars were becoming visible. "In Vietnam, I learned two things that stuck with me," he said. "First, that violence, even when necessary, always leaves scars on both sides. And second, that the men who made it home weren't always the strongest or the fastest." "Who were they then?" Dex asked. "The ones who found something worth living for, something bigger than themselves." Harold glanced at his companion. "Took me 50 years to figure out what that meant for me. Figured you might get there faster with a little help." They reached the corner where their paths would diverge, Dex to his mother's apartment in the eastern part of the neighborhood. "Harold to his building 3 blocks west, same time tomorrow?" Harold asked. Dex nodded. "I'll bring Trent. And maybe Keith, he's the youngest one from before. Smart kid, just needs direction. One at a time," Harold advised. "That's how you build anything that lasts." As Dex walked away, Harold noticed his posture. Straighter, more purposeful, less like someone expecting a fight around every corner. Small changes, but real ones. Harold continued toward his apartment, his steps lighter than they had been in years. The weight he'd carried since Vietnam hadn't disappeared. Such burdens never truly vanish. But it had shifted somehow, become balanced by something new. Purpose, perhaps. Or hope. Mrs. Chen was watering her evening primroses as he passed. "You're out late, Mr. Jenkins," she called. "Community meeting," he replied with a small smile. She studied him for a moment. "Something's different about you." Harold considered this. "Not different," he finally said. "Just awake." As he climbed the stairs to his apartment, Harold thought about the letter he'd started writing that morning, his first communication in decades with the men from his unit who had survived. It was time to reconnect, to share not just memories of what they'd endured, but stories of what they'd built afterward. Inside, he went to his window as he did each evening, looking out at the neighborhood that had been merely a backdrop to his life for so long. Lights glowed in windows. People moved along sidewalks, a community that had always been there, waiting for him to truly join it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The program would face setbacks. Some kids would resist help. Old habits would threaten new beginnings. But for the first time since returning from a war half a century ago, Harold Jenkins felt he was finally truly home.